Good morning, everyone, and welcome on behalf of the International Press Institute, and thank you everyone for joining. My name is Amy Brouillette, and I'm the Director of Advocacy at IPI, and I'll be moderating today's panel. We're really excited for today's discussion on the very critical and timely issue of media freedom leading into Hungary's general elections in April, which is just a few weeks away. The purpose of today's panel is to introduce some of the key findings of IPI's recent press freedom mission to Hungary, as well as to hear from other experts about their insights about the state of media freedom in Hungary and some challenges to independent journalism heading into this very critical election and beyond. So I want to welcome and thank our panelists for joining us and to share their expertise and their insights. Let me just quickly introduce everyone. We have Viktória Serdült, a journalist at HVG, which is a leading economic weekly in Hungary. We have Eva Simon. She's a senior advocacy officer with the Civil Liberties Union for Europe. And we have Jamie Wiseman, IPI Europe Advocacy Officer, and Kaius Niemi, the senior editor-in-chief at Helsingin Sanomat newspaper in Finland and a member of the IPI executive board. So just a bit of housekeeping. Each panelist will speak for about 5 minutes, and then we'll open up for some questions when anybody on this call can ask some questions. We're probably not going to take questions during the panel just to ensure that everybody has a chance to speak, but we'll definitely leave time at the end for some questions. So we can ask that people put their questions into the Zoom chat and then also put your name so that we can collect those questions at the end. Okay, and so just by a quick introduction, and then we'll hear from our panelists. As many on this call, know, the issue of the deterioration of the Hungarian media has been in the spotlight since Hungary's ruling Fidesz party came to power in 2010. And over the past decade, the government has exerted a mix of legal, regulatory, and economic control over the country's media market, which has radically reshaped and distorted Hungary's news and information environment. While some independent outlets exist, the media system as a whole, and particularly the broadcast sector, has been reshaped to deliver and amplify pro-government propaganda and messages in ways we've not seen in Europe since the days of communism. In February, IPI held its board meeting in Budapest and also used that as an opportunity to conduct a mission to Hungary to investigate the state of press freedom leading into the election this April. The outcome of which will have not only critical implications for Hungary and for the EU, but also in the international arena. Findings from this mission were published this morning on our website, so please go to our website at ipi.media to access the report, and we'll also put a link to the report in this chat, in the chat box. And we'll also hear in a bit from Jamie Wiseman about some key findings of that mission. But first, I want to start with a question for Kaius, who took part in the IPI mission in February. Kaius, can you give us an overview of the mission, why the IPI board chose to go to Budapest, and any reflections from any of the meetings that we had with the government and opposition representatives?
Yeah, well, good morning, everyone. Thank you, Amy, for the introduction. I'll have a couple of words of the event in Budapest. I think it was very logical to go to Budapest. IPI has been following very closely the situation in Hungary during the past decade. So I think, and there has been other activities in Hungary in the previous years. But I think now it was very crucial moment. for a couple of reasons, but of course the main reason is that there will be the 3rd of April elections, forthcoming elections to come, and of course that was the reason, you know, the press freedom issues and questions are really on the spot, and also because the opposition has had a relatively big portion of the political sphere now compared to the previous years. I think Mr. Markizai, who's the leading candidate of the joint opposition, has had actually like a quite serious stake, you know, political stake, you know, compared to the previous elections. So it was very important us to hear, and also then transpond his voice, you know, what comes to these freedom of speech and press freedom issues. So it was very interesting to meet him. We did also meet the mayor of Budapest, and then after our trip, we also had a Zoom together with the Fidesz spokesperson, Mr. Zoltán Kovács, you know, which was also very important for the meeting on the whole. I think there was another interesting moment, because it was only 1 week before the war started in Ukraine. So we're actually discussing about and it's very telling actually that during the visit, at least myself, I didn't speak about the potential war in Ukraine at all with our colleagues and the politicians in Hungary, which is telling that I think it's a mirror of Hungarians really being very much concentrated on the domestic issues, because it's really heated up, and that's very understandable too. What was really interesting for me myself was actually how the ruling party is really efficiently trying to solidify its power base, even though they would lose the elections. So if you think about for instance, the media council, it's that those posts inside the council are for 9 years, and the council is being sort of like reorganized, you know, just before the election. So it would mean that just to make it. It's very much like it would be Fidesz oriented, even though the opposition would win the elections. There were many other features also, which meant that there's a strong political effort by the Fidesz to make everything, make every effort to still gain in power, even though the electoral votes would be for the opposition. I think meeting with Mr. Zoltán Kovács was telling a quite nihilistic story about the view from the Fidesz that there wouldn't be any sort of independent journalism at all. So he was actually questioning the whole notion of having independent journalism, and coming from a newspaper which is 132 years old, and the very backbone of our journalism is being independent, was striking actually to hear somebody saying that there's no such a thing as independence or non-alignment or so. And also Mr. Kovács seemed to be very maybe not very, but at least he seemed to be okay and pretty happy with the current state. He said that the press freedom is alive and kicking in Hungary, which means that to a certain extent the ruling party seems to be at least content, you know, for the or they seem to be happy with what they have succeeded already. Talking about the Kasma organization which is inside their envelope, and I think they have also been quite successful in dividing and conquering the media sphere in Hungary. It means severe questions that the IPI and the rest of the world, also the Hungarian journalists, have to ask themselves, that how to increase the solidarity within the journalistic community, because this divide and conquer type of tactics, they are also emitting a lot of discontent in between the journalistic community and distrust also, which is something which then becomes inbuilt. There, we heard that many journalists that have formerly worked for independent media are now having no choice other than working for media titles that are part of Kashma, for instance. And of course, that raises the question that that even those who have a strong journalistic ethos, need to feed their families and need to work somewhere, and then they might become part of this.
Kaius, can you unmute yourself?
I'm sorry. Probably no. So I was just telling that that some people who have formerly worked for the independent media, they don't have any other choice for feeding their families to work for Kashma, and it makes them then part of the Fidesz constellation. And then I think it would be interesting to just say that everything seemed to be very logical. In a negative sense, that the ruling party can really say that they are not actually imposing anything, because there are so many different, so to say, independent players, such as the Media Council, which is of course a Fidesz ruled body, or there is this Kashma Foundation, which is independent and not being operated by Fidesz, and so forth. And so everything seemed to be so convenient for them that they could oust their responsibilities, even though it was obvious that they are actually pulling the strings pretty openly, and then of course behind. And so definitely, like, meeting the opposition, also Mr. Markizai, and also the mayor of Budapest, Mr. Karacsony. I think we felt that they were speaking right things. They were worried about the current situation. They saw that especially the public television should be, and on the public public broadcasters, the whole thing the setup should be rethought. But I would have hoped to see a little bit more energy from their side as well, kind of an understanding of what would be a healthy media ecosystem. And I think that is one thing which the outside world, the other EU countries and organizations like IPI could help in order to sort of like create a value-based system which would be more, at least, open and based on open democratic values than of that what we have witnessing now.
Thank you. I think a lot of what you touched on, Jamie will now kind of review. Jamie, I wonder if you could just walk us through some of the highlights of the main findings of the mission, and yeah.
Yeah, thanks, and good morning to everyone. Yeah, Kaius has given a good kind of introduction there to some of the key issues that we heard about and we wanted to kind of investigate more during the mission. So yeah, the kind of the headline takeaway, I suppose, of the report is that ahead of the 2022 election, Fidesz has continued to systematically erode media pluralism in Hungary, while at the same time moving to kind of muzzle whatever is left of independent media there. while at the same time entrenching a pro-government narrative within the media landscape. So kind of, yeah, looking backwards, I think attacks on independent journalism in Hungary now are not as kind of widespread as they were perhaps a decade ago at the beginning of Fidesz's time in power. What we're seeing now is more of a kind of targeted surgical attacks to kind of silence, push independent broadcasters off the airwaves, as well as we saw in the case of Club Radio. So yeah, Kaius mentioned it already, but compared to other EU countries, Fidesz in Hungary now wields an unprecedented level of political control over the media ecosystem there. And it's developed over the last decade the most advanced model of media capture that we've ever seen developed within the European Union. And this essentially involved the kind of coordinated exploitation of legislative, regulatory, and economic powers to first take over control of public broadcasting and media, secondly, to concentrate private media in the hands of business allies and oligarchs, and then thirdly, to kind of entrench a pro-government narrative by distorting the media landscape to the detriment of independent journalism. So yeah, in the first section, I'd maybe just pick up kind of four key elements that we see to this model. So the engine, I think, of this media capture has been a network of allies and proxies, business allies, state-dependent companies close to Orban and the ruling party, who have over the last decade taken control of much of the country's television, radio, and print media. And many of these kind of Fidesz-aligned business allies have either handed over or donated their media holdings to Kejma, which was mentioned already. It now contains something like 500 different titles, and is really the dominant player in the media ecosystem there. So ahead of the election, I think what we've seen is that this kind of pro-government media empire has been used to shape public opinion, but also insulate citizens from challenging and critical journalism. And at the same time, the second element would be kind of the economic lubricant or fuel for this model of media capture, which has been just exorbitantly large budgets for state advertising, which have been instrumentalized to distort the media market in Hungary in a particular direction. So yeah, it was crazy to hear that in Hungary, the state is the largest advertiser in the market. In 2020, government bodies, ministries, state-owned companies spent, I think, nearly 80 million euros on advertising. That's 1/3 of the total market. And that was an increase of 21% on the previous year. So these budgets are increasing and increasing. And then are being used to kind of favor alignment with a pro-government kind of messaging. So independent media who don't toe the line have their funding withdrawn, where it's taken and then pumped into friendly media as well, many of them within Kejma. So this kind of massively oversized influence of the ruling party within the media market, only increasing year on year, has slowly allowed Fidesz to kind of calibrate the market in its favor. The third element then would just be really high levels of control over media regulation. So Kai has mentioned already, the Media Council, which has this hugely oversized power within the media market under legislative changes, which has been used to kind of arbitrarily block and deny broadcast licenses, forcing critical voices off the airwaves. At the same time, control over the competition regulator has been able to kind of block mergers of independent media while approving, on the other hand, fusions of pro-government titles. And over time, this has kind of facilitated concentration of media ownership in the hands of Fidesz's allies. And then the fourth element would just be really quickly public service media. I know Viktória is going to speak a little bit more about this, but in the 2020 campaign, we've really seen quite unbalanced and unprofessional coverage. And there's been recent revelations about exceptionally high levels of political control over the state news agency, the MTI, as well. So kind of put together, one of the key takeaways of the mission report was, that with these four elements, the takeover of independent media through business allies, secondly, control over regulatory bodies to block, through licensing decisions, thirdly, the manipulation of state resources and advertising budgets to distort the market, and fourthly, really high levels of control over public media put together these form part of the puzzle of media capture in Hungary, which has been really, really key for kind of eroding media pluralism there over the last decade.
So I just want to ask a quick follow-up on this. What does this mean for independent?
I think Amy might have dropped out there, but I think, yeah, the question maybe was what this means for independent journalism in Hungary. So I think, yeah, the key takeaway was, while of course there are still independent media there, as Kaius mentioned, these kind of market distorting practices that I mentioned have really limited both their reach and their influence. For example, so when corruption scandals are unearthed, these findings and revelations are, ignored in the public media, while also drowned out by pro-government media. And yeah, in terms of kind of independent media, really high levels of ownership of Fidesz's allies over regional and local media have meant that citizens living outside the big cities in the countryside really have a lack of access to different news sources or independent media, except online. And as well, independent journalists are still working in a very challenging climate, both in terms of access to information. So we see really high levels of kind of discrimination of journalists in terms of accessing information, both from politicians. So this means interview requests are regularly denied. Journalists from independent titles are not getting accreditation to speak or attend press conferences. But then also from freedom of information requests, this kind of thing as well. And we saw really that this restrictive climate for independent journalism was worsened even more during the pandemic, when journalists were banned from accessing hospitals, and the government also passed a law criminalizing what authorities deemed to be false news that would hinder the ability of the authorities to deal with the pandemic, which we heard created a lot of self-censorship among journalists. And then as well, we also have really disturbing revelations involving the Pegasus Scandal, where we've had concrete evidence of at least 5 media actors, investigative journalists, photojournalists, many of them investigating corruption or alleged corruption within the Fidesz, targeted by this kind of surveillance. And a real lack of accountability so far from the Hungarian state, which I think is legitimately led to legal action being taken to get some kind of accountability and an understanding of why this surveillance was carried out. And I think one of the most concerning things we heard from Mr. Kovac was that that the government would not be cooperating with the kind of new probe or investigation that's been launched by the European Parliament, which is going to be an EU-wide investigation into abuses of Pegasus. But he kind of confirmed that they would not be cooperating with that investigation. So yeah, I mean, the climate is extremely restrictive, and as Kaius mentioned, I think another key takeaway was that this kind of diversification of the pressures on independent media in Hungary, the system that I just mentioned of media capture is designed in such a way as to give Fidesz plausible deniability when they're faced with accusations of meddling. So by having its media council, which it itself appointed, take the decisions on withdrawing or refusing to renew licenses, they could throw up their hands and say, this has nothing to do with us. By having business allies buy up independent media, they can argue that the complexion of the media market is purely down to market forces only, and that they have no direct influence there. By having those state advertising budgets distributed by separate agencies, they can deny accusations of meddling. So in this way, the kind of responsibility for attacks on independent press have been kind of artificially shifted away from the ruling party. This kind of arm's length model for muzzling critical media has really been taken up and adopted more and more by other countries in the European Union as well, with kind of adaptations to suit the local market. So yeah, the conclusions were that ahead of the election, the playing field politically in Hungary has been really skewed drastically in favor of Fidesz through its high level of control over the media market. And this has raised some real questions about the fairness of the election, the ability of citizens to get a plurality of information and news, and really cause concerns about how fair this election could be going in.
Thank you. I think we should hear from Viktória Serdült. As a reporter in Hungary, maybe Viktória, you can share some of your impressions of what the scene for independent media is in Hungary, and especially in relation to the public service media, and what kind of coverage the opposition is receiving heading into this election.
Hello, good morning to all, and thank you for the invitation. Actually, it was really interesting to hear all your summary, because I've been working in media for 17 years, and I totally agree with what I've heard, but living inside of it is a bit of a different perspective. Kaius mentioned that Mr. Kovács said that press freedom is alive and kicking in Hungary, and we have independent press, which is of course the case, as I work at an independent paper, HVG, and I've been working for 17 years as a journalist in Hungary. And of course, we have independent media in Hungary, but our work is really challenging, both in case of getting information and then getting access to anything that the government wants to portray. But I thought I would give you a bit of insight into how public media works in Hungary, because that's very, very interesting. Public media is always a challenge in every country, and it has always been so in Hungary as well, not only during the times of the Fidesz government, but also in previous governments as well. But in my opinion, what happened in the past 12 years is unprecedented in the European Union. And for that, you must understand that public media in Hungary has a very strong tradition. Even 20 or 30 years ago, that was the only channel that people watched. So still a large portion of society only get their information only from public media. So at least I'm talking about 1 or 2 million people who don't really have access to independent media in Hungary. So it's very for the government, it's extremely important to control this area of information. And how they do this, I usually use the phrase the 3 Ps, and these Ps are programming, pressure, and propaganda. So let's see how programming in public media goes. Last week, I switched on public media on a Wednesday at 8 a.m. in the morning, because there's something very interesting was happening. Peter Márki-Zay, the head of the opposition, got his 5 minutes on public media. So why is it important? Because that was the only time that the leader of the opposition got airtime on public media in Hungary. So it was not in the last month, it was not in the last week, but every 4 years, the opposition gets only 5 minutes on public TV. That's required by law. But otherwise, you would not get any information from the opposition. What do I mean by that? Programming in public media is only favors the government. Can you hear me? I can see some nodding. Okay. You get maybe it's hard to imagine, but there's no programming that would be concerning the opposition parties. You only get government events, you only get government politicians talking, but in the past 4 years, no opposition politicians have been allowed in the studios. In contrast, the Prime Minister or Viktor Orbán gets airtime every week on the national radio. Every Friday they have an interview, and there was last week he had a big speech at the March 15. It's a big national holiday, and he gave a speech, and that was aired 9 times in 24 hours on the news channel. As I said, in contrast, the opposition gets only 5 minutes in every 4 years. So you see that's a big contrast on what people actually can watch on public media. Now about the pressure, political pressure. Of course, there are many journalists in public media who used to work for independent media before they abide by journalistic standards. Some of them are even my friends, so I see how they work, but they work under a constant and very, very big pressure from the government. And they were high-level investigative articles about how their work is carried out. One of these investigative articles was published in Radio Free Europe a few weeks ago. That was about political pressure in the public news channel. And for example, it is very common, it is based on interviews, of course, anonymous interviews from journalists who are working in public media. And they told journalists at Radio Free Europe that, for example, they were not allowed to use the word refugee in their reportings, or they were not allowed to cover some NGOs. They were not allowed to even write the name of climate activist Greta Thunberg in public media. So even if they wanted to do it, their editors would cross their names out of the reporting. Also, there was another investigative report at Direct 36, which is a big investigative reporting portal about the news agency, the Hungarian news agency, which is abbreviated as MTI. And the reason why it's important is that MTI is free to use for all media in Hungary. So whatever they publish, everyone can use it for free. So it's very important to see how and why they publish the articles. But political pressure at MTI is terribly strong. So even some journalists at MTI told Direct 36 reporters that sometimes even the press officer of the Prime Minister would phone and tell them to report on something, and even would dictate the title of the article. So they basically have no independence. They have phone calls from ministries saying what the title of the article should be. And one other important aspect that even influences the daily work of independent journalists in Hungary is called agenda. Agenda within MTI is a list of events, press events that are going to happen that day. So every morning I check the agenda at MTI, and then I can see all the press events or the press conferences that are going to happen, and then I can choose whichever I want to attend. So in the past few years, it has become evident that some of the press events of the government are simply left out of this agenda. So I have no idea as an independent journalist whether there's a press conference of a minister or any politician from the government. So that basically influences my everyday work. When I write an article about the ministry, I would like to make an interview with the minister who is holding a press conference, but I have no idea about it because MTI is not covering it. And lastly, if I have still a few minutes, propaganda is also very important in public media. And that has become very evident in the last few weeks since the war in Ukraine started. Just a very interesting reminder that MTI, this Hungarian news agency, started calling the Ukraine war as a Russian operation. So for a few days, they were not calling it a war, they were calling it Russian operation. That of course changed as the government changed its opinion towards Russia in Hungary, and Prime Minister Viktor Orbán started aligning with the West and voting on all the sanctions. But still, the news channel of public media, M1, is still echoing like some hints of Russian propaganda. For example, some experts and government experts were invited. They were talking about how Ukraine should have been more careful with Russia. And they also said that they were doing silly things to anger Russia. So even though the government is aligning the best, the public media is still like sort of echoing this Russian propaganda. So all this together, this propaganda, this control from the government, and leaving out the opposition completely, this gives them total control over public media, and together with Kashma and all the government papers, this really can influence a lot of people in Hungary who have no access to other means of information.
Thank you. I think I might have some question about that. Maybe we'll circle back actually after and let Eva kind of jump in here because I'd like to hear from Eva. So let's zoom out a bit, Eva, and maybe let's talk about the international perspective a little bit. You know, as you know, both Hungary and Poland have been in this clash with Brussels over the rule of law conditionality regulations, and as a result, the Commission has held back some funds, some COVID recovery funds for both countries. But more recently, there's been talk about loosening these requirements for Poland, because Poland has actually turned out to be a surprisingly reliable partner over the last few weeks with the EU and dealing with the crisis with Ukraine, whereas Hungary has been less so. So I'm wondering, from your perspective, how has the Russia's war against Ukraine changed things with the EU's posture towards Hungary, or has it at all, particularly with the rule of law conditionality?
Thank you, and thank you for having me. Well, this is a question I'm not sure anyone can answer at this very moment, because it's just the EU is a much bigger organization than, you know, reacting and triggering, you know, different enforcement mechanisms within a few weeks, and everyone is very busy with the war at this moment. So what will change, this is something that we will change in the near future, whether the situation in Poland and how the EU is measuring, I mean, and comparing Hungary and Poland. I mean, this is coming. What we can see here is that this is something to go back and see what the EU should do and what the EU should have done so far, because we remember the 2010 when the Fidesz won after the landslide victory, that the first act was introduced in Hungary was the media law. And it was submitted at that time by 2 individual MPs, so not even Fidesz. And the reason for that was to circumvent the obligation for public consultation. And we knew at that time, and with you, Amy, as well, that and also many other academics and civil society activists in Hungary, that this would have a terrible impact on the media market and on public discourse in the long run, and also on the outcome of upcoming elections. And we started to write letters and speaking out, you know, publicly about the problem, but no one was really listening to us. So so it was everyone was so open and, you know, listening what's going on. They said that, well, the media law is something, but we will see how it will, you know, turn out in reality and things like that. And this is something I think that at that time, so even 12 years ago, we argued that the media is the pillar of democracy, and these disproportionate limitations on these freedoms should be always regarded as a sign of the rule of law backsliding. And I think what happened in Hungary, this is warning for the EU. And not only because of Hungary, but there are other countries also in the EU, like think about Slovenia or Poland, or there are others who are joining this team and put pressure on media, not only on public service media, as Viktória explained to us, but also to on the whole media market. And I think the point where the EU should have intervened is that because pluralistic media is very important for people to get access to reliable information on public matters. And this has a huge impact on how people cast their votes. So it's really, there is a strong relation between free and pluralistic media and the result of a fair election. And if there is no free and pluralistic media, then we cannot call that election fair. And this is not only true for the Hungarian situation and the Hungarian upcoming election, but this is also true for the European parliamentary election. So think about, so the seats that are occupied by Fidesz in the European Parliament is the outcome of an unfair election. And the upcoming election in Hungary in April is also an unfair election in this regard, because people don't have access to reliable information and to decide and to make an informed decision how they cast their vote. So I think this is something that this proves that there is room for the EU to intervene in EU member states where such a media capture happens. And of course, I mean, you asked about Ukraine, and I think it's also very interesting to see that this massive government-led misinformation that happens in Russia and what's going on in Hungary, there are certain similarities, and it's very difficult to admit. And I know it sounds awful, but the Hungarian public service media is just showing a propaganda. And well, we have no one to run in with a billboard and protest, at least not so far. But we have similar kind of pressure as it was previously explained. So I don't want to go into details, but this is a clear sign of propaganda. And I think the EU, what the EU was reluctant to intervene, even in fields that they had the chance to do. So there are pending complaints in front of the EU regarding the Hungarian media market. Already in 2016, there was a complaint submitted with the Commission about public service media and the state aid. And in 2019, there was another complaint submitted about state advertising, and later it was updated with the KESMA, the foundation that was already mentioned by, I guess, all of the speakers before me. So these are pending cases, and the Commission was reluctant to do anything. So if I mean, now we are in a situation, and I think we can list at least 4 possibilities where the EU can intervene in a country like Hungary, or in a country where media is captured like it happened in Hungary. One is enforcing the existing laws. So there are many means, such as the complaints I already mentioned, so investigating these complaints. But there are also laws such as the Audiovisual Media Service Directive, Whistleblower Directive, Recommendation on the Protection and Safety of Journalists. So these laws and implementing these laws are crucial, and the Commission has the power to at least investigate what is going on in Hungary and also call for proper implementation of these laws. Number 2 is what you mentioned already, Amy, is applying the rule of law mechanism. So connecting the media freedom to the rule of law, it offers a great opportunity so that the Commission can investigate in 27 member states what is going on. And the Commission could initiate a joint program similar to the Commission's rule of law framework and work with the member state to improve the situation in that specific member state if there is a medium threat concerning media freedom. And there are certain ideas how to do that, and different NGOs, among others, Liberties, also elaborated a certain method how to work with the member states. So running this joint program for 2 years, an independent body should visit and stay with that specific country and report back to the Commission, because otherwise it's very difficult to get first-hand and reliable information about the media situation. And of course, if the joint program is unsuccessful, or if there is a high threat to media freedom, then Article 7 procedure should be initiated. But there are other things to do, and I think the Commission is at the moment is working on it. And this is to elaborate better benchmarks on media freedom, because the existing benchmarks are not properly elaborated for the situation. So we need special focus on state control over public media, state advertising, and protection of journalists for sure. The third thing, what can be done, is the ongoing media freedom legislation at the EU level. So it's planned for the adoption in the third quarter of 2022. Today is the last day for the public consultation. And hopefully, we haven't seen any drafts because it's still in public consultation phase. But I think a strong European Media Freedom Act, and if the Commission is brave enough also to cover some important elements, that would also, trigger and improve the level of media freedom, especially because it will be a regulation and not a directive, so it will be automatically applicable, even without implementation in member states. And, standards for public media, the basic principles about government's state aids and subsidies would be very important. Also, the appointment mechanisms of the media regulators, a transparent database on media ownership across Europe would be very important. And also the enforcement part, because this is very important, that even the best law can be a toothless tiger unless we have strong enforcement and the Commission-led enforcement, because the national media authorities in countries like Hungary, they are just not enforcing, they wouldn't enforce at least the existing authority. And of course, there are other pieces of legislation like the Digital Services Act or SLAB, the strategic litigation against public participation, would be important to pass at the EU level. So what I think, if we could, think about, all of us, what are under these 4 different means, what the EU could do, and as civil society and independent journalists and academia, just because this is the moment at the EU just to channel in what we think and make sure that we just raise these issues with the Commission so that they come up with the proper Media Freedom Act, and hopefully it will have an impact on the Hungarian media market as well.
Well, thank you, Ava. That's given us a lot to think about. That was wonderful input. Thank you. So, Jamie, maybe we could just wrap up with some. Maybe you could just review some of the recommendations that appear in the report for the government after April.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the recommendations are kind of split both for the government elected, but also we have some specifically tailored for the European Union, and a lot of those, I have to say, are along the lines of what Ava's just kind of set out. I think, one of the craziest things to kind of think about is that for all its systematic erosion of media pluralism, of media freedom, of creating this model that other countries are now following, Hungary still hasn't had any major repercussions from the European Union. And we've seen a kind of a change within the last year or so, I would say, at least of an understanding that the Commission and the European Union have to kind of increase and strengthen the toolbox that they have available to push back against these kind of illiberal practices. The Media Freedom Act is going to be a key part of that. Like we said today, the consultation changes. So we are still relatively in the early stages, and we don't really understand the contours of what that will entail yet, but it has to be tailored to being able to kind of challenge those 4 elements of media capture that were discussed earlier. So for the European Union, exactly, the Media Freedom Act, enforcing complaints that are already there. Those issues of a state aid have been in front of the Commission for multiple years now, and that Hungary has been able to get away with this essentially is only encouraging other member states. So I think there is more of an understanding that unless they push back against what's happening in Hungary, then any government in the European Union that wants to entrench its power and stay and win elections can meddle in the media market this way. So there are clear recommendations for the European Union. And in terms of the government after April 3rd, it's going to be about unraveling a decade of media capture now, which is a mix of legislative, regulatory changes, control over the public broadcaster. This is going to be incredibly complex and difficult, and there's a lot of pitfalls and obstacles for any government. But I think there has to be kind of a long-term and a short-term solution. Long-term would have to be restoring independence to the public broadcaster, pluralism to the media ecosystem, and through democratic principles. And then there are also immediate steps that can be taken to reform the public broadcaster, to depoliticize the bodies there, to make sure there's proper oversight of the public broadcaster, to sever direct lines of kind of political control over the state news agency as well, and to make the system of funding for the public broadcaster based on strict, clear criteria rather than just throwing billions of florins at it. Also, depoliticization of regulatory bodies is absolutely crucial. We've seen that the discriminatory and politically motivated decisions by the Media Council has been instrumental in forcing Club Radio and others off the airwaves. And then also that issue of state advertising, which I mentioned earlier, being able to kind of completely reform this system so that advertising is not distributed down political lines, but on under normal market conditions. This can help foster a more pluralistic media landscape. So yeah, I think there are no quick fixes here. There's no silver bullet, and whatever changes have to be incredibly, they're going to be complex. But there are competencies and powers which can be taken to unravel this media capture. And organizations like IPI, will be there to help guide and advise. We heard during the meeting in the missions that there is a political will from the united opposition to enact a lot of these changes and to rebalance the system in a fair, democratic way, which fosters viable, sustainable, independent journalism. That's the most important thing. So yeah, a lot of the recommendations in the report, I would direct you there. But yeah, a lot of work to be done, basically.
Great, thank you. Well, thank you to everybody for such a thorough and interesting overview. I think we just
Okay, Amy has dropped out, but I think she'll be joining in a second. So I can see a couple of the Q&A questions here. So we have one from Dimitra Holdis from the CEU Center for Media, Data and Society. And she had a question for you, Kaius, just related to kind of solidarity. Oh, sorry, it was based on you, but directed for Eva and Viktória. So she was wondering if you see any change in developing structures or institutions that would allow for solidarity to develop amongst Hungarian journalists. She's kind of, talking about unions or associations, and just notes that solidarity needs to be organized in one form or another, and it's difficult to sustain. So yeah, what kind of systems there are in Hungary for associations and grouping together independent journalists under one cause?
I can answer that. Of course, we have unions in Hungary. We have a union of Hungarian journalists, but that has been watered down in the past years. And the big problem in journalism in Hungary, as one of you mentioned, is that it's terribly divided. So on one side, we have like government media. On the other, we have like, let's call it independent media, what I don't really like to use this phrase. And the difference between these two sides is so big that I think it's almost impossible to talk to each other. And that's, at least as a journalist in Hungary, that is one thing we have to really change, because in order to be able to change things, we must be able to talk to each other. But at the moment, the unions that exist are not able to fulfill that task. So yes, we actually have this big task of like having more important and unions that have more strength in connecting journalists.
Yeah, I just, because this question was also, targeted at me. So I'm saying, I'm not a journalist, I'm a lawyer. So my perspective would be that self-regulation is very important, especially in field where, such as, ethical questions, where there is no place to make legislation. It's better not to make. I mean, the less we have, the better. What we need are safeguards from the legislation side. And yes, I think self-regulatory journalist centers would be crucial and very important. But this is something I can't tell, how to improve or how to support. But there must be a room for self-regulation in this field, because it's very important to let journalists work. And I wouldn't call, I think there are two groups, and maybe Viktória referred to them. So there are journalists and there are propagandists. And but there are, of course, journalists in public service media who are oppressed. And the journalists should join, and the propagandists should be just, left out, because there is, no way to have a conversation between these two groups. So maybe, this is the way to select those who really, work as journalists.
Thank you. We also have a question from Judith at Club Radio. Her question, and it's a great one, is in what way can the media authority be changed to become an actual independent body in the case of a government change? Does this mean, to change the media law would require a 2/3 majority, which seems quite unlikely, or at least be quite difficult. So what suggestions does anyone have for how to tackle the problem of the Media Council?
This is one of the major dilemmas, and I think it would just circle back to something that Kaius mentioned right at the beginning about how Fidesz, ahead of the election, has been trying to kind of entrench its control over this body, with having the former head of the council step down and kind of clear the path for someone else to be appointed on a 9-year term. So there are big debates about in what way this system can be depoliticized and democratized. And there are two, there's a kind of more forceful idea to reestablish a kind of, to dismantle the body and then rebuild from scratch. That would be one perspective. The other would be to try to democratize through existing practices based on assessing the people on the council based on professional standards, and then penalizing breaches if they're found to have taken place there, in terms of how decisions are made, how much the body is politicized. But it's a very good point that the 2/3 majority looks unlikely to be, if the opposition were to win, it looks unlikely that it would be a 2/3 majority. So yeah, unraveling and dismantling a system built with a 2/3 majority without that same kind of majority in parliament is going to be very hard. So I think some kind of mixture of applying additional EU regulations to political control over media regulatory bodies, as well as kind of domestic practices in terms of increasing oversight of those bodies. So there's no simple question. No simple answer, and that's one of the main kind of problematic areas, as well with the public broadcaster as well. How do you reform this broadcaster, which clearly needs to happen, but in a democratic way, which doesn't just fight fire with fire and lead to mass resignations and firing as well. Those questions, remain to be answered.
Yes, and there's a question also from George Harshine from NAPSABA. And his question is about how to restore media independence within the public service, within the public service media. What can employees of the public service media do about daily cases of violations to journalistic freedom and direct orders and censorship? So is there something that journalists who currently work at the public service media can do to kind of reassert their independence?
I mean, these revelations that we saw recently about the public media, as well as the state news agency, came through journalists who were working there, bravely blowing the whistle and, leaking emails and documents, giving us a real kind of magnifying glass into how this control works and how extreme the level of political involvement is over stories, headlines, this kind of thing. So any mechanisms that can increase transparency over the inner workings of this is really helpful for helping external bodies understand the scale of the problem within these bodies. It's incredibly tricky because, Kaius again mentioned at the beginning that people, have to take home a paycheck. They have to be feeding their families, and there's a lot of fear of speaking out and a lot of self-censorship within these media as well. But yeah, anything that can be done to kind of to show the public, show citizens how things actually work there is a step that journalists there can take, I think.
Thank you. I think we have time for a couple more questions, and then we're about 5 minutes over, so maybe we'll wrap after maybe 2 more, if that's okay with people. Actually, 2 different people have asked about the situation of journalism schools in Hungary, and maybe either Viktória or Eva could take that one and explain about whether or not there's journalism schools in Hungary and how that works.
I think it's better if Viktória answers this question.
I try to do that. I went to a journalism school 17 years ago. That was the school of the Hungarian Journalists Association. So at that time, journalism as a profession was much more like as a profession taught at schools. But after the Fidesz take over the media, at least in my experience, journalism schools have really lost their momentum. And I don't want to criticize independent media for this, but something that was clearly missing is bigger newspapers just giving out scholarships or employing interns. So this was really not the case in Hungary for a long time. But to end on a more positive note, journalism schools are really still not very prevalent in Hungary, but most of the bigger papers, including HVG and another big paper, Telex, they started their internship programs last year and this year. So I think what's happening now is that independent media are trying to educate young people, and they have this wonderful people in their 20s working as interns for HVG and also for Telex. So it's more like internship programs and not journalism schools. So this is what you can, if you want to be a journalist in Hungary, that is the path you should take. And some of the universities also have departments specialized in communications, and that's another way. But and the Hungarian Association for Journalists is also starting another journalist course. I think it's this year. So yes, that we haven't had very thorough journalism schools in Hungary in the past few years, but I think something is changing, and it's changing for the better now.
Great. And then I think there's 2 questions that I'm gonna combine kind of into one. One is from Christoph at HVG, and the other is Jackie, a freelance journalist from Germany. Both of them are asking about what the EU essentially can do in terms of banning state advertising. Maybe Eva, this is a question for you. The question is, shouldn't the EU just ban state advertising in the media altogether, essentially?
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. The EU will not ban state advertising as it is because we have 27 different member states with 27 different financing mechanisms. And some of them are working properly, while in other countries there are problems. And we didn't really mention COVID. But COVID also had a huge impact on financing the media systems in each of these countries. I mean, in each of EU member states, even in Germany. So I mean, the Reporters Without Borders is warning that in Germany, because of the smaller and local media publishers faced economical challenge because of COVID-19. It's even in Germany, media pluralism is undergoing a slow but steady erosion. And this is true for, I mean, to all of the EU member states. So the question is how state subsidies and state advertising and financing work. And I think, the first step is always transparency. And this is the problem also in Hungary, that it works in a highly untransparent way. So public service media financing is just billions of forints. It's just lost. It's not task related. It's not defined. No one knows how it's spent. So the having transparency is the important first step. It will not solve the problem. This is the same with the ownership situation. So I think transparency and transparent databases are important. And also enforcing the existing mechanisms, because this is what we see now in Hungary as well, referring back to the question about public service media, is that if there is no oversight, if there is no enforcement on behalf of the EU, then even the best law, Media Freedom Act, will not help these countries, and will not help those countries who have just started to approach some sort of limitation on media freedom, such as Slovenia is a good example for that. So for the EU, connecting the internal market rules to the state advertising and including strong safeguards and oversight on behalf of the Commission, I think that would be the most important part. And of course, there is no way to ask each of the member states to have same sort of financial structure, because the culture and the size of the markets are different. So you cannot compare France to Hungary, or you cannot compare Germany to Hungary. There are certain reasons for that. One is language. So the Hungarian media market is very small. But there is one thing: the competition rules of the EU should be applied, and not only at the EU level. So comparing, because in this case, Hungary is a relatively small market, so it's not distorting the whole European media market. But if you take each of the market based on local markets and language markets as well, then you can see and pinpoint that even Kesma in the Hungarian, in the local market, is monopolizing the ownership structure of the media. So there are certain things through competition to intervene from the EU level, but solving the problem of a member state, it really depends also on the journalists and on the political culture as well. And I don't want to, just ruin it, but we know, as Viktória already mentioned, that even previously, before Fidesz, there was high pressure on behalf of the government, especially on public service media. So it has a long history, but maybe this is something that, everyone has learned so far, except for Fidesz, that making too much pressure on public service media, this is a method that should be stopped. And instead of working this way, letting journalists work would create a better environment for Hungary, and of course lead to a fair election.
Thank you. So I think just one more quick question, and then we'll just wrap up. And this is my question actually. I mean, I think as we've seen over the past, I guess, more than a decade, really what's going to happen in the Hungarian media market is going to be determined domestically. This is going to be a domestically solved problem. So, and how the new government, if there is a new government, or approaches the situation is going to be quite important. And there's a lot of eyes on how a new government could work and go about re-democratizing the media. So I'm wondering if either Eva and Viktória or anybody else has any immediate thoughts about what are the main hazards and challenges to this? What's the main thing that a new government in the scenario that we get a new government would have to look out for when trying to reestablish a democratic and independent media in Hungary?
I only have a few thoughts on this. I think, withdrawing. So just leave the media work. So in the minute the government stops putting pressure on the media, on public service and also independent media outlets, because we didn't really touch upon that, but there's also pressure on independent media, and also putting pressure on the media council that could already have certain good outcomes. I really believe that those who are serving and supporting the government capture, if there is a new government and there are new values, these people will just quickly follow the new values. So this is promising. So, I mean, there are many people who are operating within this system, but those who are just publishing the propaganda today, they will have to feed their family tomorrow as well. And if there is no pressure from the government, then they might come up with real pieces of news. So I think the first thing is just to leave the journalists' work independently, and then restructuring the financing system of the media. So that would be very important to task-related media systems, with special regard to public service media. And then in the long run, change the media council, if possible, or at least make sure that challenge their decisions if needed, because we can still believe that the court would come up with proper evaluation of decisions made by the media council.
Thank you. Anybody else have a?
I think I would, basically echo what Eva said. And I think the main pitfalls, the way we would see it, would be a kind of a rush to move too quickly were there a change in government, to kind of plow forward and try and unravel and unwind this capture of regulatory bodies and public media. But I think in a political system, there will be a lot of pressure on a new government to make and enact changes quickly. During the meeting with Mr. Markizai, he told us that he thinks that if there's not structural quick change to the public broadcaster, the media regulator, then a government would not last more than 2 years, because the huge creation of through the Fidesz media empire, attacking it on a daily basis, with still control over the public broadcaster and the regulator, would be impossible for them to operate. So he was more in favor, at least he said, of quite a quick and immediate changes. Whether this might push too far and end up, using the same anti-democratic tactics that have been used to create the system in the first place is a big pitfall. That kind of made up the key element of our recommendations to the new government, or a new government. Would it be any changes have to be done through established democratic, measures, challengeable in court, done through strict and transparent criteria to re-establish a kind of viable system for independent media. But yeah, in a political landscape, that might be easier said than done.
Great, thank you. That might be a good note to end on, I think, unless anybody has anything more to add. Viktória, Kaius?
Okay, so regarding what any next government should do, whether it's Fidesz again or whether it's the United Opposition, I think I can just join in with Eva, who said that just please let us do our jobs and let us work freely and give us access to information. So if that happens, our work is going to be more balanced and they'll be able to carry out proper journalism in Hungary, which is, I think at the moment, it is missing for so many reasons.
Yeah, I fully agree with Viktória, and I'm just adding that still there's a possibility to do independent journalism in Hungary, which is very important. So in the end of the day, we have to, I mean, whatever the outcome of the election is, we have to show strong support, you know, from outside to our Hungarian colleagues. We've had great time together with Telex and when trying to sort of like help Telex to sort of like re-establish themselves, and we have been extremely proud of the team, because they are so enthusiastic. They have been extremely like focused on what they're doing. And actually, it's a fantastic miracle what they've done, you know, in these circumstances. So there is always a possibility, and we can see that that there is a stake for journalism and independent journalism in Hungary, and I think you just have to hang on it and give a lot of support for our colleagues.
Great, thank you. So I think that that's it for today, and thank you to all of the panelists